Hi everybody and welcome to my watercolor channel. My name is Sarah and today I'm going to be painting a landscape from a reference photo I took on the Olympic Peninsula at Hurricane Ridge. And while I go through this painting process, I wanted to talk to you about some of the editorial decisions and changes I made while I was painting. Some things that didn't go to plan, some things that I was getting frustrated with, and some things that I just had to redo entirely. And so as I was editing this, I kept in a lot of those places where I had to end up changing things as I went and kind of learning as I went, and still ended up with a painting that I was proud of. So let's take a look at my reference photo. I took this last summer. This is looking at the Olympics, and this is a reference photo I feel pretty comfortable with. My favorite thing to paint is mountains, and I'm really happy with how these ones turn out. I look at this reference photo and I know I want to change the sky. So this is a blue sky with a lot of clouds, and I feel like painting a little bit of a sunset or a sunrise, depending on what direction we're facing. I think this is facing west. So I want to have some orangey peachy in the sky and incorporate that in my bottom section of the painting with wildflowers. So let's get started. Sometimes when I'm painting, I will sketch out where I want the shapes to go first. Sometimes I won't. In this case, I really want to know where the tops of the mountains are going to be, and I want to know where my field is going to be. If I were going to paint this again, I might bring that field up and have less of the mountains and hills in that middle section. But in this case, I try to keep the shapes relatively true to the reference photo. Like I said earlier, I want the sky to be more of a sunset or sunrise or whatever you want. So I know that having an orangey, yellowy, peachy with a blue is risky. Right now I'm wetting my paper because I'm going to be doing wet and wet. If I'm laying down those colors near each other, run the risk of having these complementary colors mix and turn into brown or mud or gray, or sometimes even green, depending on the shade that I'm using. And so if I'm really scrubbing the page, there's more of a risk of me mixing those colors, and I really don't want that. So what I'm going to be doing is laying down the orange peach first while the page is wet, and then coming in and laying in the blue around it, but leaving this kind of band of white in between the two colors. And as the paper dries, those colors are going to soften and come together a little bit, but they're not going to mix into this color that I don't want. For the sky, I'm using my current favorite color, which is a Naples reddish yellow, which is the perfect kind of peachy sky color. I'm putting that into my wet sky, kind of at an angle, kind of angling up as if the clouds are kind of getting swept up. And I'm letting that kind of sit for a second, deciding on the shapes that I want. And now I'm going in with ultramarine blue, and I'm going to do my best to keep that white space in between. I'm going the opposite direction, coming down at an angle with that blue sky. I'm being very careful as I get to that orange. I'm not trying to mix those colors together. I'm trying to place the blue down softly, and so there can be blue kind of in between some of these clouds, but we're not mixing. And so you'll see I'm being very gentle down at this section and kind of just dotting these areas of blue in. It's not a perfectly flat wash of blue, and I'm happy with that. And now you can see it's dried a lot lighter. I don't have any green. It's just this nice soft orangey cloud blue sky. Now I'm going in and doing wet and wet with the field area as well. So I'm first going in with a paint called Green Gold, which is this great kind of base layer. I'm putting that in kind of at random. I'm adding in some of that Naples Reddish yellow mixed with my blue. I'm trying to keep my color palette pretty simple. If I use the same colors over and over and use them to mix other colors on my painting, it looks a lot more cohesive. So for instance, if I want a green, instead of pulling a new green, I can mix my yellow and my blue and get a green that kind of matches the vibe of the rest of the painting. I'm going in with kind of a pinky color, and this is one example of how I'm adding in a lot of stuff that's going to end up getting covered up. And that's just straight up part of the painting process. I used to get frustrated by having layers of my painting that didn't really end up visible. And so I'm kind of pouring my heart out for these parts that I don't even see at the end. And I kind of have to make peace with that nature of watercolor, that we're building up layers and that just adds richness. And part of the fun is just doing it, regardless of how it looks in the end. So I'm adding in some of that ultramarine blue. I'm also adding in some indigo, which I'll be using for my darkest darks. I'll talk about that later. And as the field is wet, I'm adding in that darker green. Again, I'm letting this all kind of meld together. It's going to dry lighter. I'm going to build up those layers, and then it's going to look like a pretty field of wildflowers. I'm going in even darker, and this is looking really dark, but you'd be surprised by how much lighter this is going to dry and how kind of muted it all ends up being, and how I have to keep adding in those layers of dark. All right, this is dry now. You can see that it's become kind of muted and kind of melded together, and we're going to add to that. But right now I'm going to add in my favorite part, which is the tops of those mountains. Now I'm pulling that indigo, which is my favorite kind of dark blue black, and I'm going to be using a small number 2 brush and using dry brush. So I have paint on my brush, and as I drag it across the paper, you can see it pulls off color, and it uses that texture of the paper to kind of make this speckle. I'm playing around right here on the paper, having more or less wet paint on my brush. And if it's too wet, I dab it off. If it's too dry, I add more. And then I hold my brush nearly parallel to the paper, and with the lightest touch, I'm dragging it across the paper. I have to be brave. If my paintbrush was too wet, it would have just smeared a full layer of paint. So I knew I wanted to dab it off and have it be kind of drier, kind of know that level. That's why it's helpful to practice on a piece of paper first. And what this does is kind of tricks the eye into seeing snow and rocks. And I'm dragging it across intentionally to have some areas have more rock and some areas have more snow. I don't have to be super true to the reference photo. And in fact, I'm not going to be. The reference photo doesn't have a ton of snow, and I want more snow. So I'm just making that decision. I'm dragging my brush over the same area several times to get some darker shadow or more rock areas. I don't want the whole mountain to look the same pattern of speckle. So that's why I'm adding some areas that have less snow on it. And all of a sudden these peaks emerge. And it's just my absolute favorite thing to do with watercolor. All right, so I have mountains I'm happy with, and now this middle section of the painting is the part that I get frustrated with, and I have to tread carefully. So I'm wanting to show mountains and hills and some texture and have it all meld together and blend. And I'm going to have to build that up with layers. I'm kind of tentative here. I'm putting down this kind of medium gray wash, knowing that I want it to blend in with this kind of snowy rocky peaks. So I'm taking my brush and kind of feathering up some of that medium gray to blend in with the tops of the mountains. And right now it looks like just this big splodge of gray in the middle. I don't want this hard line underneath the peaks of the mountain. I'm letting that dry, knowing I'm going to be adding more layers and darker than I think it needs to be because it's going to be drying lighter. And I'm trying to kind of, as I go, figure out how I'm going to have the peaks tie in with the hills and the rest of the mountain. I'm going in darker here, and I have this bad habit of doing this top section and then adding super wet below it, which if I'm not careful will result in a bloom, and it's happened a lot. Now, blooms are great if you use them on purpose and want them, or that's the vibe you're going for. Blooms are not what I want here, so I'm being careful to add more liquid here all the way at the top all the way down to the bottom so I can get a flatter wash, kind of, and not so many blooms. Again, I'm using my brush to kind of feather up some of that medium gray color into the snowy rocky part of the mountain so it looks like the mountains are coming down, that we have those snowy peaks and then they're coming down into non-snowy rocky part of the mountain. I sometimes say that every painting has an ugly stage where you just have to power through and trust the process and remember your training. And here's an example of what I think is the ugly part of the painting. I'm kind of losing my confidence, but I know I have to power through and stick with it. Here I'm adding in some striations. I don't know if that's the right word, but these kind of veins of the mountains to show the shape of where the hills are coming down. I love how this ends up looking, and then it dries super light, and then I end up covering it up anyway. So here's another example of something not going to plan. I'm liking this, but the problem is I'm liking how it's looking while it is wet. And as it dries lighter, it nearly disappears, as you can see here. And then I go in kind of out of order and add this foreground hill, and I'm going to have to go back in. What I should have done is gone to that kind of striation area and added that back in darker until I was happy with it. And what I do instead is I add this kind of middle ground hill, which I know I wanted to add in there, and then I have to go back in and add those darker elements to those farther mountains again and kind of be careful not to let it all bleed together. So I'm going kind of out of order at this point. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. I'm trusting the process and also allowing for the fact that it might not work out because I know I'm going in an order that doesn't totally make sense. As I'm bringing that color down, I know that I want some trees in that right section of the painting, so I know I don't need to make it very dark. Here I'm adding some of those darker elements and texture again to this section of the mountain, and I'm going to want to add some of those striations again. Every time I get frustrated with it, I just let it dry and then reassess. You can do a lot after it's dried, but if you're fiddling while it's wet, sometimes you're shooting yourself in the foot a little bit. So again, I'm kind of going out of order and adding some little tree textures to that middle hill. because I'm trying to decide if those back mountains are just done and they're going to blend into the background, or if I really do want to add back in that texture and striations. And this is me deciding to go for it. I'm assessing, I'm looking at the whole picture, and I know I want those details in those farther mountains. Here's my reference photo again. You can see kind of those lines coming down, helping show the shape of those farther mountains. And here I go. I'm adding those downward lines to help guide the eye down and have them look more like the reference photo. I'm using a darker paint than last time because I learned from that previous mistake that it's going to dry way lighter, and if I want it to have that impact, I need to use a darker shade, a darker shadow color. And I'll be honest, at this point, I really didn't know if this was going to turn out looking how I had envisioned. I lost a little bit of confidence with how many layers I did in this middle section, and I ended up really loving how the mountains looked. I was really pleased. Oh, there she goes. I know I don't really need to bother with adding a lot of texture down where I'm going to put the trees, but I just want to add a little bit of that variation of the mountains and have it look like it's coming down into these like valleys and hills, and that there's this perspective and distance. I'm at a point where I'm decently happy with the top 2/3 of my painting. And now I'm adding in some more detail to my field of wildflowers. I'm going in with a darker green, and here's another example of how I'm putting some things down that I'm going to end up changing a little bit. So I have a newer brush that has a nice crisp tip, and I'm using that to flick the brush up and create these little grasses. As I go back in the field up the page, I'm getting smaller and lighter to show that perspective and depth. And the lower on the page, it's darker and it's bigger, so it's taller. Here I'm adding in some splatter, thinking that I'm done with this field, but I am not done. I'm going to add in the splatter, and then later I'm going to reassess as I look at the whole painting and realize that there's more I want to add to carve out some of these plant shapes. So I'm splattering by getting paint on my brush and then tapping that brush against another brush to release it. I'm demoing on this scrap paper. I'm covering up the rest of my painting so it doesn't get on the mountains, but you can see as I'm tapping on there, the splatter's coming off. I'm using this kind of pink color to splatter these flowers on the field. And she doesn't know it yet, but it's all going to get covered up. I'm looking at it as a whole. I'm standing back, I'm squinting my eyes, and something doesn't feel totally right. My first instinct is to add in the trees. Trees make things look so finished and polished and complete, and I love adding trees. And I'll talk about my process with that, but that doesn't end up fixing it. I'm going to add in my trees, and then I'm going to go in and add some finishing touches to the field. The trees are going to be the darkest part of my painting. I'm using that indigo. I'm loading up my brush, and I add trees by having this kind of broken trunk and then dabbling my brush back and forth. That's not the right word. I'll show it up close on a paper in just a second, but it's almost like I'm doing calligraphy or cursive for random shapes. I'm squiggling my brush back and forth in this little script motion to suggest the branches and the needles and stuff like that. There are so many different ways to do trees in watercolor, and you can find some amazing tutorials based on the style that you want. I really like these because they get at the kind of wild shapes you get in the Pacific Northwest, but they're still a little gestural. They're not perfectly realistic. I can kind of get some wonky trees. Sometimes I don't even put in the trunk because I already know how tall I want it to be and the shape I want it to be. So I start really thin at the top and then gradually cone out at the bottom. I'm not having them all be nice, neat little soldiers in a row. I'm kind of spreading them out and alternating how tall I want them to be. In the reference photo, we only have trees on this side, and I'm deciding whether or not I want trees on the other side as well. And your girl loves a tree, so I do decide to add in more and make that change from the reference photo. I'm going over this first one to be a little bit taller. I'm looking at it, I'm squinting my eyes. When in doubt, squint your eyes to look at your painting to kind of get a sense of the contrast and the values and the composition even. And I decide, yes, indeed, I do want trees over there, so I'm going to add a couple little baby ones too. Okay, I'm looking at it, and something about it still doesn't feel right. The bottom section still feels unfinished compared to the top 2/3 of the painting. So I'm going to go back in with more paint on my brush with this dark green. And instead of just flicking up with these little grasses, I'm going to still keep it pretty vertical and add in darker shadows around these areas of wildflowers. So it feels a little like I'm undoing some of my work, but I'm still keeping some of those grass textures. I just know I want it to have more contrast and darker colors. I'm even dry brushing back there because it's so far in the distance that everything's really small. And then I'm using wetter washes near the bottom where it's closer to me and there's more of that shadow. And before my very eyes, I'm way more pleased with it. I'm going to add in dots to suggest individual flowers. I'm not being too technical with it. I've mixed this kind of random pinky peach and white gouache so that it becomes more opaque. And just dappling that in where I feel like I want the wildflowers to go. But what this means is I'm covering up pretty much all of that previous speckle, but do not worry. I will add splatter back in as my very last step. This time I'm finishing off by adding pure white splatter. So I'm grabbing white gouache from my palette, getting it the desired wetness. If it's wetter paint, it'll be bigger droplets. If it's drier paint, it'll be smaller droplets. I'm kind of going middle of the road here. I'm focusing my splatter on the very bottom, the closest to the viewer, in those corners, and then the smaller splatter near the back of that field. My current guideline with watercolor is when in doubt, just add some splatter, see what happens. And I end up really liking how this looks. Ta-da! A field. Now we get to do the best part, which is take the tape off. You never know how a painting's really gonna look until you take the tape off because it's deceiving. You have all this paint on the tape that suddenly disappears, and then it looks nice and crisp and clean and beautiful. Oh yeah, everyone likes a good tape pull. I don't know why this one is so difficult for me. Let's go. And there she is. Most importantly, when I look at it, I think of being on Hurricane Ridge and looking at the Olympics. And that's the goal with painting from reference photos, especially ones that I take myself from a trip. So I hope you enjoyed watching. If you try it out yourself, let me know how it goes. If you try out any of these techniques, let me know, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, bye.